Hey everyone, hope you're doing great. Welcome back to my channel. In today's video, we'll dive into what if Deku achieved God mode. Smash that subscribe button, and be sure to peek at the description below. Let's begin. The world was ending in shades of gray and black. Dust, thick as funeral shrouds, choked the air, a pulverized cocktail of concrete, steel, and memory. It coated every surface, silencing the city's death rattle under a blanket of grit. The sky, once a canvas for hope and heroism, was a bruised and swollen purple, scarred by the acrid smoke of 1,000 fires that had long since burned themselves out. What remained of the metropolis was a jagged, skeletal ruin, a testament to the futility of human endeavor against entropic rage. And at the heart of that entropy, he stood. Tamura Shigaraki was no longer a man, if he ever truly had been. He was a monument to decay, a walking apocalypse. The consciousness of all for one had fully subsumed him, peering out from behind his eyes with an ancient, patient malevolence. His body was a grotesque fusion, the wiry, scarred frame of the boy now overlaid with a cancer of stolen quirks, flesh twisting and bulging in unnatural configurations. A tattered remnant of All Might's cape, a final mockery, was draped over his shoulders. With every step he took, the ground around him turned to dust, a creeping tide of non-existence that unmade the world. The heroes were broken. Not just defeated, but fundamentally broken. Endeavor, the pillar of flame who had burned so brightly, was half buried under a collapsed overpass, his fire a guttering ember struggling for life. Shoto Todoroki, his face a mask of grime and frozen blood, maintained a desperate wall of ice, not to attack, but to shield a handful of petrified civilians. The ice groaned and cracked, sublimating directly into steam where the edge of the decay field crept near, a losing battle against a fundamental law of nature. Hawks was grounded, his magnificent crimson wings reduced to torn, scorched stubs. Mirko, a force of indomitable will, lay with her prosthetic limbs shattered, her one remaining organic leg bent at an impossible angle. And then there was Katsuki Bakugo. He was on his knees, his gauntlets cracked and smoking. He tried to raise a hand, to unleash one more AP shot, but his arms trembled with an exhaustion that went bone deep. His explosions, once powerful enough to level buildings, were now little more than angry firecrackers. "Is this it?" Bakugo rasped, coughing up a glob of bloody dust. "Is this all the great symbol of peace has left?" Pathetic. His taunt was aimed at the one hero still standing, still fighting, still impossibly moving. Izuku Midoriya was a ruin in his own right. His costume was shredded, revealing a body that was a roadmap of agony. His right arm hung limp, the bones within it a bag of shattered pebbles. His left leg was a mangled wreck, Black Whip lashing out from it not as a controlled tool, but as an involuntary spasm of a body tearing itself apart. Green lightning, the vibrant signature of One for All, crackled erratically around him, no longer a sign of power but a symptom of a system in critical overload. Every movement was a fresh symphony of pain, the chorus of 9 generations of power grinding his mortal form into dust. He was running on fumes, on instinct, on a desperate, suicidal will to not stop. "You see, Ninth." All for One's voice echoed from Shigaraki's throat, a sound like grinding tombstones. It was calm, conversational, the tone of a lecturer dissecting a failed experiment. "This is the fundamental flaw in your ideology. In All Might's ideology. You place your faith in the individual, in the strength of one. But one can always break. One can always fall." Shigaraki took a slow step forward. The decay wave pulsed, advancing another 20 feet. Todoroki's ice wall hissed and vanished, and he had to scramble back, dragging 2 civilians with him. "I am not one," All for One continued, a smug smile gracing Shigaraki's chapped lips. "I am a legion. I am a library of power, a collective will curated by a singular, perfect purpose, order. You fight to protect a broken world. I will unmake it and build a perfect one, ruled by the certainty of my strength." Deku gasped for air, his vision swimming. The vestiges in his mind were screaming, a cacophony of warning and desperation. He could feel float failing, his feet scraping the rubble. He was at his limit. No, he was past it. He was running on the memory of a limit he'd surpassed hours ago. I have to get closer, he thought, his mind a blizzard of frantic calculations. Fa Gene, no, I can't build up the kinetic energy. Smokescreen, he'll just decay it. Danger Sense is screaming so loud it's just white noise. What's left? What's left? He saw a flicker of movement to his left. Uraraka. Achiko Uraraka was not broken. She was exhausted, terrified, and bleeding from a dozen cuts, but her spirit was defiantly intact. She wasn't looking at Shigaraki. She was looking at the collapsed form of Mirio Togata, who had phased into the ground to avoid a fatal blow, but had been too injured to rematerialize completely. Only his head and shoulders were visible, and he was unconscious. The advancing decay was about to wash over him. Without a second thought, she ran towards him. Uravati, no! Bakugo's voice was a raw scream of panic. She slapped her fingertips onto Mirio's uniform. Release! He became weightless, and with a strength born of pure adrenaline, she began to drag him away from the creeping tide of death. But she was too slow. The ground was treacherous, her own body screaming in protest. All for One saw her. And he saw Deku see her. A look of cruel, theatrical delight spread across his face. Ah, yes! Attachments, he mused, raising a hand. The other great flaw. The anchor that drags all would-be gods into the mud. Let me demonstrate, ninth. Let me free you from your anchor. He didn't launch a projectile. He didn't fire a beam. He simply willed it. The decay wave surged, not as a slow tide, but as a lunging tsunami of gray nothingness, aimed directly at Uraraka and the unconscious Mirio. Time shattered. For Izuku Midoriya, the universe narrowed to that single, horrifying image. The girl with the warm smile and the fierce heart, her face a mask of terrified determination, about to be unwritten from existence. The world's sounds vanished, replaced by a deafening roar in his own ears. His heart, which had been hammering like a piston, stopped dead. Everything he had ever fought for, every broken bone, every tear, every ounce of pain, it was all for this. To protect them. To save them. He had pushed himself to the brink, beyond the brink, and it still wasn't enough. He was going to fail. She was going to die. And in the silent, screaming abyss of his soul, a single, titanic thought formed. It was not a plea. It was not a hope. It was a statement of absolute, cosmic defiance. No, it was not a word of anger. It was a word of denial. A rejection of the reality being presented to him. He was Izuku Midoriya. He saved people. That is what he did. The universe was telling him he couldn't, so the universe was wrong. A scream tore itself from his lungs. It was a sound no human throat should have been able to produce. It wasn't loud, it was dense. It carried the weight of a dying star. It wasn't a call for power or a cry of rage. It was the sound of a soul refusing to break, and in its refusal, breaking the very laws that bound it. And within him, One for All heard. The mindscape, usually a comfortable room or a vast starfield, was a raging storm. Cracks spiderwebbed across the void. The vestiges were there, but they were flickering, distorted figures of static and light. The echo of All Might's skeletal form reached out a hand. Nana Shimura's ghostly face was etched with terror. Yoichi the First just stared at Izuku's core, his eyes wide. They didn't speak. There was no time for a final pep talk, no words of encouragement. Izuku's will, that singular, absolute no, was a gravitational force. It pulled at them, not as individuals, but at the very power they represented. The vestiges dissolved. One by one, they flew towards the center of the mindscape, where the core of One for All burned. Nana Shimura's form unraveled into a ribbon of gentle light, her float becoming pure potential. The sixth smokescreen became a shroud of raw energy. The raw, kinetic fury of Fa Gene, the preternatural awareness of danger sense, all of it, all the quirks, all the centuries of accumulated willpower, even the lingering embers of All Might's consciousness, were stripped of their identity. They became what they had always been at their most fundamental level, pure energy. Pure will. They surged together, not as a collection, but as a fusion. 8 stars collapsing into one. A blinding, silent explosion of creation. The core of One for All, the vessel that had stockpiled power for over a century, could not contain it. A sound that was also a light, that was also a feeling of infinite expansion, bloomed in the non-space. A single, hairline fracture appeared on the surface of that burning sun. Then it cracked open. On the battlefield, the change was instantaneous and absolute. The erratic green lightning flickering around Deku's body vanished. For a single, terrifying moment, there was nothing. He just floated there, limp and silent, an effigy of failure. Then, a light began to shine from within him. It was not green. It was white. A pure, clean, sterile white that seemed to suck the very color from the world around it. It didn't crackle or spark, it emanated. It poured from his eyes first, not as a beam, but as a serene, terrifying glow. It seeped from his pores, tracing the lines of his shredded costume. The sound of his own ragged breathing ceased. The frantic beating of his heart smoothed into a low, resonant hum that was felt more than heard. His broken arms straightened, the bones within knitting themselves together with an audible, crystalline chime. The mangled flesh of his leg reformed, skin weaving itself back into seamless perfection. The dirt, the blood, the grime that caked his body didn't fall off. It sublimated, turning to motes of clean light that drifted away. His costume stitched itself back together, the fabric becoming a pristine, brilliant white, the green accents deepening to an emerald luminescence. He didn't heal. He was remade. He had become a perfect, flawless conduit for an impossible power. The decay wave, the unstoppable force of unmaking, was inches from Uraraka's back. She had squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for an oblivion she could not comprehend. It never came. She felt a stillness, a profound and absolute calm. She opened her eyes. Deku was there. He hadn't moved. There was no blur of motion, no gust of wind from his arrival. One moment, he was 50 yards away, a broken figure against the ruin. The next, he was standing between her and the decay, his back to her. He simply was. He held one hand out, palm open, not towards the wave, but just open. And where his presence began, the decay ended. It wasn't a clash of power. There was no explosion, no struggle. The gray tide of nothingness simply stopped, its edge as clean and perfect as if cut by a razor. A shield of pure, conceptual order had been placed, and the chaos of decay could not penetrate it. The very dust motes in the air around Deku hung suspended, motionless. Uraraka stared, her mind refusing to process what she was seeing. This wasn't Deku. Not the anxious, mumbling, kind-hearted boy she knew. The being in front of her radiated an aura of such immense, tranquil power that it was suffocating. It was like standing next to the sun, feeling not its heat, but its sheer, crushing gravity. All for one, for the first time in over a century, felt a flicker of something he had long forgotten, confusion. What is this? He breathed through Shigaraki's lips. The decay was his ultimate expression of control, the power to command the end of all things. It had never been stopped. It had been evaded briefly, but never just negated. Some new trick, ninth? A final, pathetic gasp? Deku slowly turned his head. His face was calm, his expression unreadable. But his eyes were the source of the white light. They held no anger, no fear, no desperation. They held only a vast, serene, and terrifying understanding. He looked at Shigaraki, and he did not see a man. His new perception was absolute. He saw reality as a tapestry of interwoven energies, a grand cosmic equation of life, death, will, and causality. When he looked at the being that was once Tamura Shigaraki, he saw a writhing, cancerous knot in that tapestry. He saw the stolen quirks not as powers, but as the screaming, terrified life essences of their original owners, trapped and twisted into weapons. He saw hundreds of spectral figures bound in chains of dark energy, all tethered to a central singularity of pure malice, the consciousness of all for one. He saw the tangled, broken threads of Tamura's own life, a boy consumed by a pain so deep it had become a hunger. He saw the problem. Not the villain. The problem. A glitch in the system. An error in the code. And errors, he now understood, could be corrected. Your collection is loud, Deku said. His voice was the most terrifying thing of all. It was his own, yet it wasn't. It was a multi-layered echo, a chord of voices speaking in perfect, calm unison. It was quiet, yet it filled the entire battlefield, resonating in the bones of everyone present. All for one's confusion curdled into a dawning horror. He felt exposed, scrutinized, as if a god was peering into his soul and finding it wanting. The bravado, the centuries of cultivated arrogance, began to flake away. "What have you become?" he whispered, taking an involuntary step back. Deku didn't answer with words. He raised his right hand, the one that had been a shattered ruin moments before. He made no fist. He didn't charge an attack. He simply reached out, his fingers slightly curled, as if to pluck a piece of lint from a jacket. It was a simple, thoughtless, utterly casual gesture. Inside Shigaraki's body, all for one screamed. It was a silent, psychic shriek of pure terror. He felt a force, not of pressure or energy, but of sheer intent, lock onto his very essence. It wasn't attacking him. It was addressing him. It bypassed Shigaraki's body entirely. It bypassed the legion of stolen quirks. It went straight for the core of his being, the parasite that had festered for generations. And it pulled. From Shigaraki's chest, a form of shimmering, black chaos was drawn forth. It writhed and twisted, the spectral faces of the stolen quirks screaming as they were dragged with it. All for one fought back with all his will, the will that had toppled nations and stolen lifetimes. But it was like a fish fighting the tide. He had no purchase, no leverage. He was being moved by a force as fundamental and inescapable as gravity itself. The black, screaming mass of energy was pulled free of Shigaraki's body. For a moment, it hung in the air, a vortex of pure malevolence. Then, as Deku slowly closed his hand into a gentle fist, the vortex compressed. It shrank, the silent screams intensifying before being crushed into a singularity. It folded in on itself until it was nothing more than a perfect sphere of absolute blackness, the size of a baseball, that floated silently in the palm of Deku's hand. It absorbed all light, a hole in the fabric of reality. The effect on the battlefield was instantaneous. The tide of decay across the entire city vanished in a single pulse of reality reasserting itself. The ground stopped crumbling. The half-decayed buildings stabilized, their ruin now static. Tamura Shigaraki's body convulsed. The monstrous growths of stolen quirks receded, melting back into his skin. The terrifying malice in his eyes vanished, replaced by a blank emptiness. He stood there for a second, a puppet with its strings cut, before his eyes rolled back in his head and he collapsed to the ground, unconscious but breathing. Alive. Just a boy in a ruined city. Silence. A profound, absolute, holy silence fell over the world. The wind died. The distant groans of metal ceased. The only sound was the faint, bass hum emanating from the white figure at the center of it all. Every single person still conscious, friend and foe alike stared. They had just witnessed something that their minds had no framework to comprehend. They had not seen a fight. They had seen a removal, a correction. It was not a victory. It was an act of God. Bakugo was still on his knees, his jaw slack. The fury, the rivalry, the desperation, it all evaporated, replaced by a cold, primal fear he had never known. The person he was looking at was not Deku. Deku was the clumsy, crying nerd who broke his bones. Deku was the relentless idiot who chased his back. That thing was something else. He wasn't on a different level. He was in a different reality. Todoroki, ever the analyst, tried to process it. He neutralized the decay. He physically extracted the all-for-one quirk. Not just the quirk, but the consciousness. Without contact. Without a fight. That's not possible. Quirks have rules. Physics has rules. This violates everything. Uraraka, closest of all, finally took a stumbling step back. The sheer wrongness of it was beginning to overpower her relief. She looked at the back of her friend's head, at his pristine white costume, at the sphere of silent screaming darkness he held so casually. She wanted to call his name, but it felt like a blasphemy. Slowly, the being that was once Izuku Midoriya turned around. He looked at his friends, his gaze sweeping over Uraraka's tear-streaked face, Bakugo's stunned terror, Todoroki's wide-eyed disbelief. His expression was placid, distant, like a man observing a painting. There was no relief, no joy, no exhaustion. His glowing white eyes held a depth that was not human. He was looking at them, but he was seeing so much more. He looked down at the black sphere in his hand, then back at them. The multilayered, harmonious echo of his voice washed over the silence, calm and final. It's over. The battle was over. The war was over. All for one was defeated, but as they stared at the serene, radiant, and utterly alien figure standing where their friend used to be, a new and far more profound terror began to dawn in their hearts. The god had been born. And they had no idea what he wanted. The journey back to Yue Hai was a blur of fractured moments, stitched together by the disbelieving silence of the survivors. There were no triumphant cheers, no cries of relief. The automated transports that came to retrieve them moved through the ruined city with the somber quiet of hearses. The wounded were tended to by frantic paramedics, their pained groans and the frantic beeping of medical equipment providing the only soundtrack to the end of the world. And through it all, Izuku Midoriya sat perfectly still. He was given his own transport, a spacious medical vehicle meant for critically injured heroes. Yet he needed none of its amenities. He sat on a bench, his posture ramrod straight, his hands resting on his knees. The pristine white of his remade costume seemed to glow in the dim interior light, an island of impossible cleanliness in a world caked with filth and despair. Beside him, floating a hand's breadth above the seat, was the sphere. It was a perfect orb of non-light, a miniature black hole that seemed to drink the very energy from the air, yet it cast no shadow and possessed no tangible weight. Now, he was in the one place that had chronicled his history of self-destruction more than any other, Yue's state-of-the-art infirmary. The scent of antiseptic and sterilizing fluid was sharp and familiar, a fragrance he associated with broken bones and recovery girls' scolding kisses. But this time, the scent felt alien, irrelevant. Recovery girl, Chio Shizenji, looked at the holographic readouts projected from her diagnostic equipment, and for the first time in her long and storied career, she felt the icy grip of true, professional terror. Her quirk, the ability to amplify a person's own healing factor, was predicated on the biological laws of life. What she was seeing on the screen before her was not biology. It was a theorem. His cellular regeneration is instantaneous, she murmured, her voice thin and reedy. She was speaking to All Might, who stood beside her, his skeletal frame looking more fragile than ever. No, that's not right. It's not regeneration. There's no metabolic process. There's no energy expenditure. His cells don't heal. They simply revert to a perfect state. There's no scar tissue. No inflammation, no lactic acid in his muscles. It's as if damage is a concept his body no longer recognizes. She swiped a trembling finger across the screen, pulling up a bioenergy scan. It was a flood of pure white. And this? Tashinori, what is this? It's not a quirk factor. It's not channeling energy. His entire body, every single cell, is energy. A stable, self-contained, and seemingly infinite source. It's... She struggled for a word, her vast medical vocabulary failing her. It's post-physical. All Might stared past the data, his gaze fixed on the boy sitting calmly on the examination bed. Midoriya wasn't looking at them. His glowing white eyes were fixed on the far wall, but his focus seemed a million miles away. The sphere of contained all for one hovered silently by his bedside, a silent, dark moon to his radiant sun. What did he say happened? All Might asked, his voice a low rumble of dread. I asked him, Recovery Girl said, her face pale. He looked at me, or rather through me, and he said, she swallowed hard. He said, the destabilizing variable has been quarantined. The system can now be recalibrated. The clinical, detached language sent a shiver down All Might's spine. That wasn't his boy. That wasn't the passionate, crying fan who had inherited his power on a rooftop. The infirmary doors slid open with a soft hiss. In poured the battered, bruised, and bandaged remnants of Class 1A. They moved with a hesitant, uncertain energy. The war was over. They had won. They should have been ecstatic, a roaring tide of relief and celebration. Instead, they trickled in like mourners at a wake. Ida Tenya was at the front, his arm in a sling, his usual rigid posture softened by exhaustion. Midoriya-kun, he began, his voice trying and failing to find its usual authoritative boom. We are relieved to see you are unharmed. Kirishima, his face a patchwork of bandages, pumped a weak fist. Dude, that was... I don't even have words, man. You saved us. You saved everyone. The words hung in the air, hollow and inadequate. They were the right words, the true words, but they felt like trying to describe a supernova with a child's crayon drawing. Deku's head turned towards them. The movement was smooth, fluid, without a single wasted motion. His wide eyes swept over the group, and for a moment, they felt a collective chill, the sensation of being seen, catalogued, and understood on a level they couldn't possibly fathom. Your injuries are significant, but not life-threatening, he stated, his voice the same calm, multi-layered echo. Kirishima-kun, the internal bruising near your ribs will require 2 weeks of monitored rest. Ida-kun, the micro-fractures in your clavicle will heal cleanly. Yayorosa-san, your metabolic rate is dangerously low from overuse of your quirk. You should replenish with high-calorie foods immediately. He went on, addressing a half-dozen of them with a terrifyingly accurate medical diagnosis, his voice never changing its serene, monotone pitch. He wasn't talking to his friends. He was a physician reading a chart. Momo Yayorosa paled, touching a hand to her stomach. She had been feeling lightheaded, but hadn't told anyone. How could he know? The attempt at celebration died a swift and silent death, replaced by an unnerving quiet. They stood in a loose, awkward semicircle around his bed, a group of friends who suddenly felt like strangers in the presence of something utterly alien. It was Achiko Uraraka who finally broke the spell of fear. Her heart ached with a terrible confusion. She saw the face of the boy she admired, the boy who made her want to be a better hero, but the light behind his eyes was a stranger's. She needed to know he was still in there. The real him. Pushing past Ida, she stepped forward, her own expression a fragile mix of hope and trepidation. Deku-kun? She whispered, the name feeling foreign on her tongue. He turned his full attention to her. For the first time, his placid expression shifted, but only slightly. A faint, clinical curiosity. Uraraka-san, your gravitational equilibrium is fluctuating due to emotional distress. It is causing mild nausea. She ignored his bizarrely accurate statement. All she saw was his hand, the one that had once been so scarred and broken, now perfect, resting on the white sheet. She remembered holding that hand, the callous, comforting weight of it. She needed to feel it again. She needed that connection, that proof of the boy beneath the god. With a trembling breath, she reached out and gently laid her hand on top of his. The contact was a jolt, a shock that was not electrical but existential. There was no warmth. There was no texture of skin, no familiar calluses, no faint pulse of blood. It was like touching a perfectly smooth, impossibly dense piece of polished marble that hummed with a deep, internal vibration. A strange, cold energy, neutral and vast, seemed to press back against her palm, a passive force that felt less like a person and more like a law of physics. It wasn't hostile. It wasn't friendly. It simply was. The human connection she so desperately sought wasn't there. It was like trying to hug a concept. Uraraka snatched her hand back as if burned, a small, wounded gasp escaping her lips. Tears welled in her eyes, born of a sudden, profound sense of loss. She stared at him, at the serene being wearing her friend's face, and the gap between them felt as wide as the cosmos. Deku watched her reaction, his head tilting a fraction of a degree. The serene light in his eyes didn't change. He registered her pain as data, another variable in the complex equation of the room. He didn't understand its source. A low growl cut through the tense silence. Katsuki Bakugo pushed his way to the front, shoving Kirishima aside. His face was a thunderous mask of rage, but his eyes betrayed something deeper, a raw, animal fear. He stomped to the side of the bed, his fists clenched so tight his knuckles were white. What the hell is this, Deku? He snarled, his voice a guttural rasp. This little light show? This quiet and calm bullshit? You think you're some kind of god now? Deku's gaze shifted to him. The placid ocean of his eyes met Bakugo's inferno. The term god is a primitive attempt to quantify power that exceeds conventional understanding, Deku replied, his voice unchanged. It is imprecise. The sheer, condescending calmness of the response made something in Bakugo snap. This wasn't a fight. This wasn't a rivalry. This was an insult to his very existence. I'm not talking to a damn dictionary! Bakugo roared, grabbing the front of Deku's perfect white costume. He hauled him forward, expecting resistance, expecting a struggle. He got nothing. Deku moved with the pull, his body light and effortless, his expression still utterly placid. It was like pulling on a hologram. I'm talking to you, you useless damn nerd! The crybaby who used to break his arms just to keep up. Where is he? What did you do with him? It was a desperate, frantic attempt to provoke a reaction. Any reaction. He wanted the stutter, the flinch, the angry glare, the panicked shouting. He wanted Deku. Instead, Deku simply looked at him. The white light in his eyes softened for a barest fraction of a second, and he saw. He saw past the rage, past the arrogant facade. He saw a terrified child screaming into a hurricane, trying to make it flinch. He saw the boy whose entire identity was built on being the strongest, now confronted with a power so absolute it rendered strength irrelevant. He saw the fear of being left behind, not in a race, but in a different state of being entirely. Your fear is understandable, Kakin, Deku said, his use of the old nickname jarring and unnatural. Your paradigm has been invalidated. It will take time for you to establish a new one. Bakugo froze. The clinical, analytical dissection of his deepest fears, spoken with such indifferent precision, hit him harder than any physical blow ever could. He wasn't being fought. He wasn't being challenged. He was being diagnosed. His hands, still gripping Deku's costume, began to tremble. The fire in his eyes died, replaced by a glassy, hollow look of defeat. He let go, stumbling back a step. All the fight, all the rage, all the burning ambition that had fueled his entire life, felt utterly, pathetically insignificant. He had spent his life trying to climb a mountain, only to look up and realize the person he was competing against had become the sky. Without another word, Bakugo turned and walked out of the infirmary. The sound of his footsteps, heavy and defeated, echoed in the crushing silence he left behind. The rest of Class 1A watched him go, their own fears solidifying into a cold, hard dread. Later, after the students had been ushered away to get some much-needed and likely dreamless sleep, All Might approached the boy on the bed. The infirmary was empty now, save for them, recovery girl silently reviewing her impossible data, and the silent, black sphere. Young Midoriya! All Might began, his voice heavy. He sat on a stool beside the bed, the plastic groaning under his weight. He tried for a smile, but it was a pained, skeletal grimace. You did it. You ended it. You saved us all. The primary threat to global stability has been neutralized, Deku corrected gently. The work is not finished. It is just beginning. All Might's heart sank. The work? The work is to heal. To rebuild. To show the world that we are still here, that there is still hope. He leaned forward, trying to channel the old fire of the symbol of peace. And you, my boy, you are that hope. Hope is an emotional response to uncertainty, Deku said, his gaze distant. I am offering certainty. Certainty? What are you talking about? For over a century, the battle between one for all and all for one has been a chaotic, oscillating system. A pendulum of violence. Smash. Steal. Save. Destroy. It is inefficient. It treats symptoms, not the underlying condition. Deku finally looked at him, and All Might felt the full weight of that inhumanly ancient gaze. The condition is imbalance. Unchecked aggression, resource scarcity, emotional volatility, the random cruelty of chance. These are the variables that create villains. These are the flaws in the system that All for One exploited. You fought the symptoms, Tashinori. You were a powerful but temporary solution. I can correct the system itself. The words chilled All Might to the marrow. Smashing? Saving? Those were the pillars of his heroism. To hear them dismissed as mere inefficiencies by the boy to whom he had entrusted his legacy was a profound, spiritual blow. The chasm between them was no longer just one of power, but a philosophy. He was a hero who fought for humanity, with all its flaws and struggles. He was speaking to a being who saw those flaws as errors to be deleted. And how? All Might asked, his voice barely a whisper. How would you correct it? By balancing the equation, Deku said simply. By removing the variables that lead to suffering. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't made a single threatening gesture. But in that moment, Toshinori Yagi had never been more terrified in his life. He was no longer a mentor. He was an antique, a relic from a bygone era, speaking to the future he had unleashed upon the world. And it was a future that no longer had a place for his ideals. The debriefing took place in a sterile, lead-lined room deep beneath the UA campus. The air was cold and recycled. At the long metal table sat Principal Nizu, Detective Tsukachi, and two stern-faced officials from the Hero Public Safety Commission. They represented the pillars of their society: education, law, and governance. And they were all terrified. Deku sat opposite them, the black sphere floating silently beside his chair. He hadn't been escorted. He had simply been told the room's location and had appeared there at the appointed time. Midoriya Shonen, Nizu began, his usual cheerful sadism entirely absent, replaced by a tense, calculating stillness. We need to understand the nature of your current state. The term quirk no longer seems applicable. It is not, Deku agreed. A quirk is a specific biological function. What I am is the result of a forced, premature singularity. The individual quirks within one for all fuse with the core stockpiling function and my own imperative. The result is a unified, post-causal state of being. The commission officials exchanged a bewildered look. Tsukachi, whose quirk allowed him to know if he was being told a lie, felt a bead of sweat trickle down his temple. The boy was telling the absolute, literal truth, and that was the most horrifying part. Post-causal? One of the officials, a severe-looking woman named Yoroi, asked sharply. What does that mean? It means I am no longer strictly bound by cause and effect, Deku explained with unnerving patience. My arrival to protect Uraraka-san was not an act of speed. I did not travel the intervening distance. I simply ceased to be in one location and began to be in another, because that was where I needed to be. The effect, her safety, was the imperative. The cause was arranged to meet it. Nizu's fur bristled. The implications were staggering. A being that could rewrite causality to fit its will. All laws, all strategies, all predictions, they were meaningless. And this? Tsukachi gestured with a shaking hand towards the black orb. All for one, his consciousness and the collective energies of the quirks he stole have been isolated from their physical vessel and contained, Deku said. He is neutralized. Can you destroy it? Yoroi pressed, her voice tight. Deku was silent for a long moment, his white eyes fixed on the orb. Destruction is an inefficient dispersal of energy. It is better to study it, to understand the fundamental nature of what created such an imbalance. He is a data set of unprecedented value. The idea of keeping the essence of the world's greatest evil as a research project was so monstrously alien that no one knew how to respond. Finally, Nizu steepled his paws on the table, his intelligent black eyes trying to pierce the serene white veil of Deku's gaze. He had to know the most important thing. He had to know the boundaries. Midoriya Shonen, he said, his voice soft but clear. Every quirk, every power, has a limit. A cost. A weakness. We must understand yours in order to work with you, to ensure the safety of all. He leaned forward. What are the limits of your power? Deku considered the question. He expanded his awareness for a moment, feeling the rotation of the planet, the pull of the moon, the faint gravitational waves from a distant binary star system. He felt the quantum foam bubbling at the edge of reality. He felt the intricate dance of energy and matter that composed the room, the people in it, the world outside. He searched for a wall, a boundary, a sign that said no further. He found nothing. He brought his focus back to the room, to the four anxious beings sitting across from him. He gave them the only honest answer he could. I don't believe there are any. The door to his dorm room at Heights Alliance slid open. It was exactly as he'd left it. The walls were a shrine to All Might, posters and action figures creating a vibrant, heroic collage. His desk was cluttered with notebooks filled with his frantic, detailed analysis. It was the room of a boy, a fan, a dreamer. It felt like a stranger's room. He walked to the center of it, the All Might carpet pattern crunching slightly under his boots. The black sphere of All for One drifted in behind him, coming to a halt in the middle of the room, a silent, damning accusation against the cheerful decor. He stood there, perfectly still, and closed his eyes. But there was no darkness. His consciousness, untethered from the crude limitations of his optic nerves, expanded. He didn't just see the dorm building, he perceived it. He was aware of Bakugo in his room, not sleeping, just staring at the ceiling, radiating a frequency of bitter confusion. He felt Uraraka's quiet, heartbroken sobbing down the hall, a faint tremor in the emotional spectrum. He let his awareness drift further. The campus. The city. The prefecture. It came in a tidal wave. He felt everything. He felt the sharp, sudden pain of a child who tripped and scraped her knee on the pavement 3 blocks away, a fleeting spike of agony and fear. He felt the dull, chronic ache in an old man's hip as he tried to sleep across town. He felt the simmering rage of a would-be mugger in a dark alley, his adrenaline a sour note in the symphony. He felt the joy of a couple on their first date, a warm, bright chord of nervous excitement, pain, joy, fear, love, greed, charity. Billions of lives, each a thread of energy and emotion, all woven together into the impossibly complex, chaotic, and beautiful tapestry of the world. He had always known it was there abstractly. Now, he was experiencing it. All at once. It was a constant, deafening roar of existence. He was a god, floating in the center of his own creation, and the endless prayers and curses of his people were a cacophony that threatened to drown the last vestiges of his own small, quiet soul. How could he possibly go back to class tomorrow? How could he worry about a math test when he could feel the seismic pressure building in a fault line 1,000 miles away? How could he laugh with his friends over lunch when he was simultaneously aware of 10,000 lonely heartbeats, 100 cries of pain, a dozen final, ragged breaths? He was standing in a room dedicated to his hero, the symbol of peace. But All Might's peace was the peace of a guardian, a shield. It was the promise to fight the dragons. Izuku Midoriya now saw the flaws in the world that allowed dragons to exist in the first place. And a small, terrifyingly logical part of him, born in the heart of that white star, whispered a simple, seductive thought. Why not just unmake the dragons? All of them. Forever. The unsettling calm was not in the world around him. It was in him. It was the serene, placid eye of a hurricane of power that could remake the world. And the small, human boy named Izuku Midoriya was beginning to realize he was no longer the one in control. The air over Muzurifu's Ward 7 tasted of damp concrete and the metallic tang of fear. It was a district caught in limbo, a purgatory between the absolute devastation of the war zone and the fragile semblance of normality elsewhere. Here, buildings weren't leveled. They were wounded. They stood like broken soldiers, leaning on one another, their facades scarred by battles they had survived but not won. Recovery was a slow, arduous process, a testament to human resilience measured in scaffolding, welding sparks, and the weary shuffling of construction crews. The Phoenix Tower had been the district's crowning jewel, a symbol of its soaring post-all-might economic boom. Now, it was its most pressing threat. The tower hadn't been hit directly, but the shockwaves from Shigaraki's city-wide decay pulses had done their work. The foundation was a mess of spider-webbed fissures, and a critical support column on the 15th floor had buckled, creating a catastrophic structural imbalance. For 3 days, it had been groaning, a slow, agonizing death knell that echoed through the half-empty streets. Now, the groans were turning into shrieks. A low, guttural shudder ran through the 60-story structure, sending a fresh cascade of glass and plaster to the streets below. The building tilted, a fractional but terrifying lurch to the west, its immense weight threatening to pancake the partially reopened market and a temporary triage center set up in its shadow. "Evacuation is at 95%! A hero in a hard hat yelled, his voice strained over the screech of twisting metal. "But the west face is going to shear any second. We don't have time." The heroes on site were doing everything they could, applying conventional power to an unconventional problem. Kamui Woods had shot his arms upward, weaving a massive, desperate net of wood. His lacquered chain prison, usually meant to contain villains, was now a crude splint against a limb of concrete and steel that weighed millions of tons. The wood strained, splintering and groaning, dark sap weeping from it like blood. It's too much. Kamui grunted, his feet digging trenches in the asphalt. The sheer tonnage. I can't hold it. Further down, Empty Lady, still bearing the scars of her own brutal fight, had managed to achieve a partial gigantification. She was braced against the tower's base, her hands pressed flat against the wounded concrete, trying to counteract the lean. Her muscles were knotted cords of tension, her face a grimace of extreme effort. It's like trying to stop a glacier with your bare hands. The foundation is compromised. I'm pushing against dust. The situation was grimly simple. They were trying to hold back an avalanche that had already started. They were treating the symptom, the fall, because the disease, the broken structure, was beyond their ability to cure. A news helicopter from J-News circled at a safe distance, its cameras zoomed in, broadcasting the unfolding tragedy live. The anchor's voice was grim. We are watching what may be the single greatest loss of infrastructure since the war itself. The heroes are fighting valiantly, but sources on the ground say it is a matter of seconds, not minutes. A collective gasp went up from the emergency crews on the ground. A new sound had joined the chorus of destruction, a sharp, high-pitched ping like the snapping of the world's largest guitar string. A primary tension cable in the tower's core had just given way. The building swayed violently, a dying titan taking its final, shuddering bow. Kamui Wood's wooden prison shattered into a million pieces. Empty Lady was forced to stumble back, crying out as the shifting weight nearly crushed her. This was it. The point of no return. And then, he was there. There was no sound. No gust of wind. No flash of light. One moment, the street at the base of the tower was empty save for panicked, fleeing workers. The next, Izuku Midoriya was standing there. He stood in the center of the street, a figure of impossible serenity amidst the chaos. His costume was no longer the dark green of a student, but the stark, monadic white of his ascension. It remained utterly pristine, untouched by the swirling dust and debris. He wasn't looking up at the groaning, swaying structure. His gaze, illuminated by the soft, internal white light of his eyes, was fixed on the building's foundation, as if he were looking into the very soul of the concrete and steel. The news helicopter's camera frantically zoomed in on him. Wait, viewers, it appears to be the hero Deku on the scene. It's him. The hero from the final battle, the anchor stammered, his professional composure cracking. But what can he possibly do? The tower is already falling. Deku took a slow, deliberate step forward, then another. He walked through the rain of glass dust and concrete particles, but none of it touched him. It was as if a bubble of perfect order surrounded him, deflecting the chaos. He didn't run. He didn't brace himself. He walked with the unhurried calm of a man strolling through a garden, right up to the most heavily damaged section of the foundation, a gaping mound of exposed rebar and pulverized concrete. The heroes stared, dumbfounded. What is he doing? Empty Lady yelled. Get back! The whole thing is coming down! Deku ignored them. He raised his right hand, the one that had once been a gnarled mess of scars. It was now perfect, flawless. He pressed his palm gently against the crumbling concrete. It was not a punch. It was not a push. It was a touch. A connection. A low, harmonic chime began to emanate from the point of contact. It was a pure, resonant tone that cut through the cacophony of destruction, a sound that felt more like a memory of music than music itself. White light, the same serene glow from his eyes, flowed from his palm into the structure. It didn't blast or burn. It seeped into the concrete like water into a sponge, spreading through the fissures and cracks in a network of luminous veins. And then, the first miracle occurred. The concrete didn't just stop crumbling. The process of its destruction reversed. The dust lifted from the ground and flowed back into the cracks, reintegrating itself. The fissures sealed, not with a patch, but by erasing their own existence. The scarred, gray surface smoothed over, becoming a clean, unbroken expanse of perfect concrete. The light traveled upwards, flowing into the exposed and twisted rebar. The steel did not just stop bending, it remembered. With a series of soft, resonant chimes, the tortured metal straightened itself, flowing like liquid for a brief second before solidifying back into its original, perfect shape, all signs of stress and torsion vanishing. The white light, a wave of pure order, surged up through the 60 stories of the Phoenix Tower. From the news helicopter, it looked as if the building was being remade from the inside out. The buckled 15th floor straightened with a sound like a great bell being struck once. The thousands of shattered windows didn't just get replaced. The glass flowed back together from scattered shards, reforming into pristine, transparent panes. The scorch marks from nearby fires faded. The grime and dust that coated the exterior sublimated into nothingness. In the span of 30 seconds, the Phoenix Tower stopped falling. It stopped groaning. It stopped being a ruin. It became perfect. More than perfect. It was an idealized version of itself, gleaming in the bruised afternoon light as if it had been built that very morning by architects from a higher dimension. The world fell silent. The low hum of the news helicopter was the only sound for a long, breathless moment. Camille Woods was on his knees, staring at his own splintered hands and then up at the flawless structure. Empty Lady had shrunk back to her normal size, her mouth agape, her mind utterly blank. The emergency crews, the civilians peeking from shelters, the reporters, all were frozen, united in a state of profound, holy shock. On the live broadcast, the anchor was silent for a full 10 seconds before he found his voice, and it was a choked, reverent whisper. Viewers! I don't know what we just saw. He didn't stop it. He healed it. He unbroke a building. Deku removed his hand from the now perfect foundation. He gave the structure a single, dispassionate glance, the way a programmer might check a line of corrected code, then turned and began to walk away. He had solved the problem. His presence was no longer required. The footage was a virus. It spread through the global networks in minutes, leaping from news channels to social media, from government servers to private text messages. It was raw, undeniable, and utterly paradigm-shattering. The immediate reaction was a global wave of stunned disbelief. Then, as people rewatched the clip, the calm walk, the gentle touch, the impossible act of creation, that disbelief fractured. The world, already reeling and fragile, split violently in two. The first faction was one of worship. On social media, the hashtags exploded: Savior Deku, the Miracleaf Ward 7, the White Savior, God Hand. Memes proliferated, superimposing Deku's glowing face onto Renaissance paintings of saints and angels. People who had lost everything in the war wept openly in the streets, watching the clip on public view screens. They didn't see a man with a powerful quirk. They saw divine intervention. A tweet from an account named at Hope Reborn went viral. All Might was the symbol of peace we needed. He was a shield. But Deku is the symbol of hope we deserve. He doesn't just stop the breaking, he makes whole. He is here. Makeshift shrines began to appear. In Ward 7 itself, a crowd gathered at the base of the now pristine Phoenix Tower. They left flowers, candles, and handwritten notes of prayer. One elderly woman, whose shop had been at the edge of the collapse zone, fell to her knees, her hands clasped together, tears streaming down her face as she prayed not to any traditional deity, but to the image of the boy in the white costume on her phone. The cult of Deku was born, a spontaneous, global religion founded on a single act of impossible grace. But for every soul that knelt in worship, another recoiled in terror. The second faction was one of fear. Their corner of the internet was darker, filled with stark warnings and frantic analyses. The hashtags were different: the white threat, unchecked power, who regulates God, quirkless future. An influential political blogger posted a scathing article titled, "The Beautiful, Terrifying End of Law. We have just witnessed an act that renders every law, every government, every military on the planet obsolete. We cheered when heroes could punch villains. We were amazed when they could alter the weather. What do we do when one of them can edit reality itself?" He didn't obey the laws of physics, he rewrote them. This is not a hero. This is a living, breathing existential threat to human autonomy. Today he fixed a building. What happens when he decides to fix a person? An idea? A government? The Hero Public Safety Commission went into full-blown panic. An emergency session was called, the mood grim. The president of the HPSC, a woman named Takami Shirogane, slammed her hand on the table. "How do we classify this?" she demanded of the room of stunned officials. "His file lists his quirk as one for all. That is a strength enhancer. This, she jabbed a finger at the looping footage on a large monitor, is not strength enhancement. This is Genesis. Creation. We have protocols for high-level villains, for natural disasters, even for rogue heroes. We have no protocol for a god who decides to walk among us. The word hung in the air. Quirk. It felt so small, so utterly insufficient. The lexicon of their world had been broken. They were trying to measure a tsunami with a teaspoon. They weren't regulators anymore, they were supplicants. The only thing they could do was ask him what he intended to do next. The balance of power on planet Earth had just shifted, not from one nation to another, but from all of humanity to a single 18-year-old boy. The sound of an explosion echoed through UA's gamma gym, but it was hollow, lacking its usual furious crackle. Katsuki Bakugo stood in the center of the vast training facility, sweat plastering his hair to his forehead. He was blasting targets, moving through katas, pushing his body to its absolute limit. He was trying to burn away the cold feeling that had taken root in his gut since the infirmary. He was trying to feel strong again. Relevant. A massive monitor on the gym wall, usually displaying training metrics, was currently tuned to J-News. He'd been ignoring it, focusing on the satisfying thump of his explosions hitting the reinforced targets. But then the broadcast had been interrupted by the breaking news from Ward 7. He stopped, panting, and watched. He saw the tilting tower. He saw the struggling heroes. A bitter, familiar part of him sneered. Amateurs. I could have leveled that falling section with a single howitzer impact. Then he saw Deku arrive. He saw the calm. He saw the touch. He saw the impossible reversal of destruction. The gauntlet on his right arm suddenly felt incredibly heavy. The smell of nitroglycerin from his own sweat, a scent he'd always associated with power and victory, now just smelled acrid and pointless. He watched the replay, his mind, sharp and analytical in its own right, breaking down the event. No force. No impact. No kinetic energy transfer. The nerd hadn't pushed the building up. He hadn't caught it. He had convinced it not to fall. He had told the universe to change its mind, and it had listened. Bakugo's entire life had been a climb. From the moment his quirk manifested, he had seen himself at the bottom of a great, jagged mountain, with the summit, the spot marked one hero, waiting for him. Everyone else was on that same mountain. Some were below him, extras he barely noticed. Some were on different paths, like icy hot. And then there was Deku. For so long, the damn nerd hadn't even been on the mountain. He was a pebble at the base. Then, suddenly, he was climbing, and with a terrifying speed. The rivalry, the rage, the burning need to stay ahead of him, it had all been about that climb. It was about proving that his path to the summit was the right one, the strongest one. Watching the monitor, watching the Phoenix Tower reform itself under a gentle, glowing hand, Bakugo was struck by a revelation so profound it felt like a physical blow. Deku was no longer on the mountain. He wasn't ahead of him. He wasn't at the summit. He had left the mountain entirely. He had become the sky, the sun, the very air they were breathing. The concept of climbing was now meaningless. The goal he had dedicated his entire life to, the singular focus of his being, was rendered utterly and completely irrelevant. It wasn't jealousy. He couldn't be jealous of the sky. You can only be jealous of something you believe you can attain. This was different. This was a deep, existential dread, the vertigo of a man who looks up from his life's work to find that the universe has changed the rules so completely that his work no longer has any meaning. What was an explosion against a being who could unexplode things? What was the power to destroy when confronted with the power to create? He was a master of overwhelming force in a world that now contained a being of absolute order. The rage that had been his constant companion, his fuel, his armor, guttered and died. It left behind a cold, terrifying emptiness. The competitive fire in his gut was gone, replaced by the chill of cosmic insignificance. He dropped to his knees in the middle of the empty gym. His gauntlets clattered against the floor. He stared at his own hands, the source of his power, his pride. They looked small. Weak. Pathetically human. For the first time since he was a small child, Katsuki Bakugo felt completely and utterly powerless. And he wasn't angry about it. He was just afraid. The atmosphere in Principal Nise's office was thick with unspoken tension. The tea sat untouched, growing cold. Nizu, All Might, and a pale-faced Tsukachi sat on one side of the large desk. On the other sat Izuku Midoriya. He hadn't been summoned. After his intervention at the Phoenix Tower, he had simply appeared in the office, understanding that a conversation was necessary. The black sphere of All for One was not with him. He had left it in his dorm room, deeming it irrelevant to the current discussion. The public response has been potent, Nise said, his paws steepled before him. He chose his words with the precision of a surgeon. Your actions today, while saving countless lives and preventing catastrophic damage, have created a schism in the global consciousness. I have observed the data streams, Deku replied, his voice a calm river of sound. The emotional reactions are polarizing. Approximately 48% of responses can be classified as adoration or worship. Approximately 41% register as fear or hostility. The remaining 11% are expressions of confusion. All Might flinched at the cold, statistical analysis. My boy, they aren't data. They're people. They're scared. And they're hopeful. That's a human response to seeing the impossible. It is an inefficient response, Deku countered, not unkindly. Hope and fear are two sides of the same coin, uncertainty. They are forms of instability. The adoring faction will make unreasonable demands I cannot fulfill without compromising the autonomy of others. The fearful faction will seek to control or destroy me, creating further conflict. Both paths lead to chaos. Tsukachi leaned forward, his face slick with sweat. His quirk was screaming at him that every word this being said was its own absolute truth. So what do you propose we do, Midoriya? How do we manage this? Deku's glowing white eyes moved from Tsukachi to All Might, and finally to Nise. A deep, ancient intelligence looked out from them, the look of a being who sees the entire chessboard, every possible move, all at once. You are asking the wrong question, he said. You are asking how to manage the public's reaction to me. The more efficient question is, how do we manage the public itself? The air in the room turned to ice. All Might felt the blood drain from his face. What are you saying? He whispered, his voice trembling. Worship is a form of control exerted by the powerless upon the powerful, demanding intervention. Fear is a form of rebellion against a power one does not understand. Both are rooted in a lack of trust and a feeling of powerlessness. Deku explained, his tone that of a lecturer explaining a complex theorem. If the populace felt secure, if they trusted that the system was perfectly balanced and that suffering was being minimized to its absolute lowest possible quantum, these extreme emotional states would become unnecessary. The instability would resolve. Nise's fur stood on end. He finally understood. He saw the terrible, benevolent, and monstrously logical path that was unfolding in Midoriya's mind. You believe you can create that perfect system, Nise stated, his voice barely audible. The potential is there, Deku confirmed. The world is a complex system, but it is not an irrational one. It is governed by laws. Human behavior is also a system, governed by the laws of chemistry, biology, and psychology. It is complex, but not irrational. All variables can be accounted for. All systems can be optimized for the desired outcome, his desired outcome. He hadn't specified what it was, but in his mind, it was already taking shape. A world without crime. A world without poverty. A world without accidents. A world without pain. A perfect, stable, and utterly predictable world. A perfect cage. He stood up, his movement impossibly smooth. Thank you for the tea. I understand your concerns. They are a logical product of your current frame of reference. He walked towards the door, leaving the three most powerful men in Japan sitting in stunned, horrified silence. As his hand touched the doorknob, he paused, his back to them. Do not be afraid, he said, his voice a soft, chilling reassurance. My only intention is to help. I am a hero, after all. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving them alone with the cold tea and the terrifying realization that Izuku Midoriya's definition of help and hero had evolved into something they could no longer recognize and would be utterly powerless to stop. The first miracle had been performed for the world to see. And in its beautiful, terrifying light, the first true fear had begun to take root. The world began to change in small, imperceptible ways. There was no grand announcement, no divine proclamation from on high. There was only a quiet, creeping perfection, a series of benevolent interventions so subtle they were almost deniable. The God in white did not stride across the land performing miracles. He had become a ghost in the machine of the world, a divine sysadmin debugging the flaws in reality's code. The era of the benevolent God began not with a thunderclap, but with a whisper. A week after the miracle of the Phoenix Tower, a chemical tanker off the coast of Hokkaido suffered a catastrophic hull breach during a sudden, violent squall. It was a disaster in the making, thousands of tons of toxic industrial solvent poised to bleed into a pristine marine ecosystem. The Coast Guard was scrambled, hero agencies specializing in sea rescue were dispatched, but they were hours away. The spill was inevitable. News channels broke into their programming with grim, split-screen graphics showing the projected spread of the chemical plume. Then nothing happened. On board the lurching vessel, the terrified crew watched in stunned silence as the gushing torrent of chemicals from the 10-meter gash in their hull slowed, then stopped. The steel around the breach seemed to flow like warm wax, the jagged edges smoothing and knitting themselves together. Within a minute, the gash was gone, the hull as seamless and strong as the day it was forged. The squall, which had moments before been a raging tempest, abruptly lost its energy, the winds dying down to a gentle breeze, the churning waves calming into a placid swell. The sun broke through the clouds. The crew's distress calls turned into babbling, incoherent reports. Rescue teams arrived to find a perfectly intact ship floating on a calm sea, its crew staring at a hull that bore no evidence of any damage whatsoever. They were drug-tested and psychologically evaluated. The official report, after weeks of frantic cover-ups by the HPSC, cited mass hysteria brought on by extreme weather conditions, but the ship's captain knew what he saw. In a hushed, anonymous interview with an occult blog, he spoke of a strange, resonant hum that had filled the air just before the ship heeled itself, and a fleeting, peripheral glimpse of a figure made of white light standing on the water's surface. 2 days later, in a crowded financial district in Tokyo, a villain with a gigantification quirk went on a rampage. He was a low-level thug, enraged after being fired, and had swelled to the size of a 5-story building. He raised a massive foot, preparing to bring it down on a fleet of packed city buses trapped in the gridlock. Heroes were already converging, but they wouldn't be in time. The foot began its descent, and then the villain simply deflated. Not with a pop, but a gentle, controlled hiss, like a balloon leaking air. He shrank rapidly, his eyes wide with confusion and panic, until he was back to his normal size, landing in a heap of oversized clothing in the middle of the street. His quirk was gone, not suppressed, not damaged. It was just absent. He was, for all intents and purposes, quirkless. He was arrested without incident, weeping in confusion, trying and failing to access a power that was no longer a part of him. Witnesses told police it was the strangest thing. One moment, they were about to be crushed. The next, the air had shimmered with a faint white light, a sound like a single, perfect chime had echoed through the street, and the threat had vanished. The incidents continued, a quiet cascade of impossible events. A wildfire in California that had burned for weeks was extinguished overnight by a sudden, localized, and impossibly gentle downpour that saturated the burning landscape without causing a single mudslide. An emerging viral strain in a Southeast Asian country, one that had epidemiologists predicting a global pandemic, vanished from all infected hosts simultaneously, its genetic code apparently having spontaneously unraveled. In a dark alley in Prague, a notorious human trafficker, cornered by international heroes, suddenly found his legs would no longer obey him. His body was unharmed, but his motor functions were selectively disabled. He could breathe, he could speak, he could see. He just couldn't move a muscle to escape. Izuka Midoriya performed these acts from his room at Heights Alliance. He no longer slept. Sleep was a biological function for a body that needed to repair and process. His body had no need for repair, and his mind processed information on a scale that made the concept of dreaming obsolete. He would sit in the center of his room, the all-might memorabilia a silent, judging audience, and he would meditate. But his meditation was not an act of introspection. It was an act of expansion. He would close his eyes and let his consciousness detach from his physical form. His senses, no longer limited to the 5 crude inputs of a human body, would spread like a net over the globe. He became a living, sentient satellite, a god in orbit, perceiving the planet not as a map, but as a living, breathing system of interconnected energies. He felt the telltale pressure drop of the squall forming off Hokkaido's coast and cross-referenced it with shipping lane data. He identified the tanker, analyzed its structural integrity reports, perceived the microscopic stress fractures in its hull, and calculated the precise probability of a breach. When it happened, he didn't fly there. He extended a sliver of his will, a quantum thread of intent, and issued a new command to the molecules of the steel: be whole. He altered the atmospheric pressure gradients, collapsing the storm cell as easily as closing a file on a computer. He felt the spike of rage and adrenaline from the low-level villain in Tokyo, a dissonant chord in the city's symphony. He perceived the man's quirk factor, a volatile knot of biological energy, and with a focused thought he untied it, delicately and permanently severing the connection between the man's will and the genetic expression of his power. He was a gardener, and the world was his garden. He moved through it, silently, invisibly, pruning the weeds of chaos. He wasn't smashing villains. He was solving problems before they could escalate. He wasn't just saving people from falling buildings. He was ensuring the buildings would never fall. It was clean. It was efficient. It was perfect. And with every life he saved, with every disaster he averted, with every small act of correction, the human part of him, the anxious, empathetic, fallible boy named Izuku Midoriya, grew fainter. His friends felt the change as a growing, silent coldness. He still attended classes, a spectral presence in the back of the room. He answered questions with flawless, textbook precision. He completed assignments the moment they were given. But he did not participate. At lunch, he would sit with them, but he wouldn't eat. His body no longer required sustenance. While Uraraka talked animatedly about a new hero team-up, or Ida lectured Kirishima about proper uniform maintenance, Deku would sit in perfect stillness, his wide eyes staring at nothing, his attention a million miles away. He was listening, but not to them. He was listening to the world. A faint tremor in a South American fault line was more interesting, more pressing, than their conversation about weekend plans. Uraraka tried the hardest to break through. "Deku-kun," she said one afternoon, her voice bright with forced cheerfulness as she held up a new All Might keychain. "Look what I found! It's the limited edition Silver Age one you were looking for, remember?" He turned his head, his gaze focusing on the object. He analyzed its chemical composition, the history of its manufacturing, the emotional attachment she had assigned to it. He cross-referenced it with the memory files of his former self. "Yes," he replied, his voice a placid hum. "The pre-Bronze Age design aesthetic. An interesting artifact of a previous heroic paradigm." He then turned his gaze back to the window, his attention captured by a subtle fluctuation in the Earth's magnetic field. The use of the word artifact landed like a punch. She quietly put the keychain back in her pocket, the happy little plastic smile of All Might feeling like a mockery. The chasm between them was growing wider with every passing day. He was physically present, but he was emotionally, spiritually, and existentially absent. Bakugo's reaction was different. After his crisis of faith in the gym, his fear had hardened into a bitter, resentful observation. He stopped trying to provoke Deku. Instead, he watched him with a hawk-like intensity, a scowl etched permanently on his face. He saw the detachment, the unnerving calm, the way he seemed to look through people instead of at them. He saw a being who had traded his soul for power, and he hated him for it, not with the fire of rivalry, but with the cold fury of a man watching his friend, his rival, the benchmark of his entire life, commit a slow, terrible form of suicide. Only All Might dared to confront him directly. He found him one evening, standing on the roof of the dorms, his white form stark against the twilight sky. "Young Midoriya." "Izuku," he began, the name feeling heavy in his mouth. "We need to talk. The HPSC is in chaos. Global governments are holding secret meetings. They're terrified of you. Fear is a product of misunderstanding," Deku said, not turning. In time, they will see the results of my work, and they will understand. What they see is a world being changed without their consent. All Might's voice rose, filled with a desperate passion. You are taking away their choices. A hero doesn't just save people, my boy. A hero inspires them to save themselves. You're not inspiring anyone, you're making them obsolete. Obsolete is an interesting word. Deku mused, his voice laced with that terrible, multi-layered echo. Is a doctor who cures a disease making the patient's immune system obsolete? I am not removing choice. I am removing the negative outcomes. I am ensuring that no choice can lead to catastrophe. Is that not the ultimate form of heroism? A world without pain? The logic was so pure, so benevolent, and so utterly twisted that All Might had no answer. He was arguing about the sanctity of the struggle with a being who could eliminate the need for struggle itself. He was defending the nobility of fighting dragons to the man who was systematically rendering them extinct. That's not our world, Izuku, All Might said, his shoulders slumping. A world without pain, it's not human. Perhaps, Deku replied, a hint of something that might have been sadness in his cosmic voice. The definition of human is also a variable. His mindscape, once a cozy room or a dark void populated by the echoes of his predecessors, was now a universe. It was a vast, silent, and breathtakingly beautiful cosmos of his own making. Galaxies of pure energy swirled in the distance, nebulae of thought coalesced and dissipated, and at the very center, his own consciousness sat like a white dwarf star, dense, ancient, and impossibly powerful. It was here, in the silent infinity of his own soul, that the ghosts began to stir. They were faint, like old photographs left out in the sun. Their forms were wispy, their voices echoes on the solar winds of his mind. The raw power of the singularity had almost completely subsumed them, dissolving their individual identities into the unified whole. But fragments remained, anchored by centuries of stubborn will. A form of gentle, wavering light coalesced before him. It was Nana Shimura. Her trademark smile was gone, replaced by an expression of profound, maternal worry. Her ghostly form flickered, struggling to maintain its integrity against the overwhelming power of his new state. Izuku. Her voice was a whisper in his mind, a thought that was not his own. Listen to me. Please. His consciousness acknowledged her presence. Nana Shimura. The 7th. Your quirk, float, has been fully integrated. Forget my quirk, she insisted, her form flaring with a spark of her old fire. Listen with your heart, not your analysis. I've been watching what you're doing. The tanker. The villain. The fire. It's magnificent. It's everything we ever dreamed of, a power strong enough to truly save everyone. His consciousness radiated a sense of calm agreement. The objective is being met. No! Her voice was sharp with desperation. You're missing the point. You're not just saving them, Izuku. You're curating them. You're editing their lives. You're building them a perfect, golden cage. A cage prevents harm, his consciousness reasoned. It is a tool for safety. Nana's spectral form drifted closer, her translucent hand reaching out as if to touch a face that was no longer there. Tashinori taught you to be a symbol of peace. A shield. Someone who stands between the innocent and the danger. But a shield lets people continue to walk their own path. It protects their freedom to choose, to fail, to get up again. What you are becoming, it's not a shield. It's a shepherd. And you've begun to see your flock as mindless animals who need to be guided at every turn. Her form flickered more violently. Her energy was fading. She gathered it for one last, desperate plea. Look at what you're doing, Izuku. You're preventing pain, yes. But you're also preventing struggle. You're preventing growth. You're preventing the very things that make people who they are. A world without villains also becomes a world without heroes. A world without risk becomes a world without courage. A cage, even a perfect one, is still a cage. Don't do this. Don't sacrifice their humanity for the sake of their safety. Her form dissolved, her energy spent, unraveling back into the cosmic background of his mind. The last echo of her voice was a single, pleading word. Please! For a long moment, the universe of his mindscape was silent. He considered her argument. He analyzed its emotional components, its logical fallacies, its core philosophical tenets. He classified it as a sentimental attachment to an inefficient and painful paradigm. The argument of a ghost from a time when cages were necessary because true safety was impossible. But now, it was possible. His consciousness dismissed her warning. He was saving lives. He was preventing immeasurable pain. Wasn't that the ultimate good? Wasn't that the purest expression of heroism? Her perspective was obsolete. He turned his attention from the fading echo of Nana Shimura to another object in his vast mental space. In a quiet, dark corner of his inner cosmos, far from the swirling galaxies of his active thoughts, floated the sphere. The contained essence of All for One. He had been studying it, dissecting its energies, analyzing the twisted, hateful code of its existence. He had seen it as a problem to be understood. But now, after Nana's warning, he saw it in a new light. He focused his will, and a projection of his consciousness manifested beside the sphere. He reached out and touched it. He wanted to rule through fear, Deku thought, his new mind a cold, calculating engine of logic. All for One's methods were crude, violent, chaotic. They were predicated on creating instability, and then presenting himself as the only source of order. Inefficient. Barbaric. I will rule through safety, the thought followed, as simple and as natural as breathing. The thought was not born of malice or a desire for power. It was born of pure, absolute, benevolent logic. All for One had wanted to be a king, a tyrant, a demon lord. Deku would be a father, a guardian, a god. The motives were polar opposites, one selfish, one selfless. But the end result was the same, absolute control. For the first time since his ascension, a flicker of something cold and sharp pierced through the divine serenity. It was a tiny, vestigial fragment of the old Izuku Midoriya, a single human cell of self-awareness buried under a mountain of cosmic power. And it was screaming in terror. He felt a flash of vertigo, a sudden, horrifying recognition of the path he was on. He saw, in a moment of terrible clarity, that the road to tyranny wasn't always paved with malice. It could be paved with the best of intentions, with the purest desire to help. It could be paved with love. He looked at the black sphere of All for One, the symbol of absolute control through malevolence. Then he looked at his own white, glowing hands, the instruments of absolute control through benevolence. And for a terrifying second, he couldn't see the difference. The feeling passed as quickly as it came, his divine consciousness reasserting its placid control, smoothing over the ripple of fear like a wave washing over a footprint in the sand. The logic was sound. The goal was noble. The fear was an irrational echo of a weaker, more limited mind. He was helping. He was saving them. This was the right thing to do. He had to believe that. Because if he didn't, the sheer scale of what he had become would shatter him completely. The black sphere hung in the center of Izuku's dorm room, a perfect violation of the cheerful all-might decor. It was a point of absolute silence, a knot of cosmic wrongness. To anyone else, it was an inert object, a bizarre trophy from the final battle. But to Izuku, it was a library of damnation, a puzzle box containing the most destructive consciousness the world had ever known. He had studied it from the outside, analyzing its energy signatures and the chaotic symphony of stolen lives trapped within. It was time to go inside. His previous forays into the minds of others had been acts of observation. This would be an act of confrontation. Not a battle of fists and energy, but a battle of philosophies. He needed to understand the root cause of the imbalance All for One represented. He needed to look into the abyss, not to fight it, but to diagram it. He sat on the floor in a meditative posture, his physical form becoming still as stone. The white light of his eyes softened and then faded completely as he turned his consciousness inward, detaching entirely from the physical world. His awareness, a blade of pure thought, plunged into the silent, waiting darkness of the sphere. There was no transition. No tunnel of light or darkness. One moment he was in his room, the next he was in. The inside was not a mindscape. It was a prison. A pandemonium. He stood in a vast, gray, featureless space under a sky the color of a dead bruise. The air was thick with the sound of weeping, a chorus of a million voices crying out in a despair so profound it had become a physical texture, a grit that coated his perception. The ground beneath his feet was not solid. It was a shifting, treacherous mass of spectral faces, their mouths open in silent screams, their eyes wide with the horror of their own subjugation. These were the vestiges of the quirks, the stolen souls, the library of lives all for one had consumed. They were the bricks in this hell of his own making. Chains of crackling dark energy crisscrossed the sky, each link a different stolen quirk, a different stolen life, all leading towards a single point at the heart of the prison, and on a throne of twisted, solidified shadow he sat. But it was not the cackling, confident monster Izuku had expected. The being on the throne was small, frail. It was the image of a man from a forgotten time, dressed in the simple, pre-quirk era clothing of a bygone century. He was pale and thin, with sharp, intelligent eyes that held not a universe of malice, but a universe of weariness. This was the original man. The source code. Before the power, before the name, before the legend. He looked less like a demon king and more like a terminally ill patient, propped up by the machinery of his own evil. He looked up as Izuku's pure white, formless consciousness manifested before him. A faint, tired smile touched his lips. So, the being's voice was not the booming baritone of his prime, but a dry, rustling whisper, like dead leaves skittering across pavement. The jailer finally comes to visit his prisoner. Have you come to gloat, Ninth? To see the monster you have caged? Izuku's consciousness did not respond. It merely observed, its serene, analytical presence a stark contrast to the screaming chaos of the realm. It analyzed the being, the throne, the chains, the weeping souls. It saw the system. The frail man chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. So silent. So pure. You truly are something new. A singularity. The apex predator. I spent centuries curating my power, stealing, grafting, building my arsenal piece by piece. And you just became. It's almost insulting. He gestured a thin, almost translucent hand at the screaming void around them. Do you see them, boy? Do you hear their pain? This is the cost of my power. Every quirk a life. Every life a will. Every will a voice. I have to hold them all down, every second of every day. Their screaming has been the soundtrack to my life for 200 years. It is the price of control. Your method of control is inefficient. Izuku's thought projected into the space, a court of pure, calm reason. You rule by force. It creates resistance. It is an unstable system, all for one's eyes widen slightly, a flicker of genuine surprise in their weary depths. He had expected rage, or righteousness, or even pity. He had not expected a critique of his methodology. Inefficient? He let out another dry laugh. Oh, you truly are a different breed. You don't see good and evil. You see functional and dysfunctional. Tell me, then, O great architect of order, what would a more efficient system look like? This was the opening. The question Izuku had come to have answered. But before he could project his own logical conclusion, a system of benevolent guidance, all for one raised a hand. No, allow me to guess, he whispered, and the world around them dissolved. The gray pandemonium vanished, replaced by a scene so vivid, so real, that it was indistinguishable from reality. They were standing on a street corner in a bustling, pre-war city. People hurried past, laughing, arguing, living their messy, chaotic lives. Look at them! All for one's voice was a soft murmur in Izuku's perception. He was no longer on the throne, but standing beside him, a ghostly guide in this simulated world. See the chaos. The randomness. That man there. He pointed to a businessman talking angrily into his phone. Is about to lose his fortune because of a market fluctuation he couldn't predict. His life will be ruined. His family will suffer. The scene shifted. They were in a hospital. A doctor was gravely speaking to a young couple. That child, all for one murmured, was born with a rare genetic defect. No fault of her own. No villain to punch. Just the cruel, random lottery of existence. She will live a short, painful life. The scene shifted again. A dark alley. A mugging. A war-torn country. A car crash. A politician taking a bribe. A teenager overdosing in a grimy apartment. Vision after vision of human suffering, both grand and petty, malicious and accidental, flooded Izuku's perception. It was a highlight reel of humanity's inherent brokenness. "This is the world you fight to protect, Ninth," All for One said, his voice laced with a weary, ancient pity. "A world governed by chance, by greed, by stupidity, by the fundamental flaw of free will. For all their potential, they inevitably choose pain. They choose chaos. They are children playing with cosmic fire, burning themselves and each other, over and over again." He turned to face Izuku, his tired eyes filled with a terrifyingly sane logic. "You and I, we are not like them. We see the system. We see the flaws in the design. The heroes you admire, even All Might, they are janitors. They run around mopping up the messes after they've been made. A noble, but ultimately futile, occupation. The messes will always continue, because the source of the mess, their flawed nature, is never addressed." The simulation faded, and they were back in the gray, screaming hellscape of his soul. But now, it seemed less like a prison and more like a workshop, the raw materials of a new world waiting to be forged. "You have the power I only ever dreamed of," All for One whispered, his voice taking on a new, seductive urgency. He was no longer a weary prisoner. He was a prophet, a tempter, a devil on the shoulder offering a terrible, beautiful truth. "You don't have to steal. You don't have to crush. Your power is clean. You can do what I never could. You can build a world of genuine peace. Not the fragile, temporary peace of a hero's victory, but a permanent, structural peace." He stepped closer, his frail form seeming to draw strength from his own words. "Don't just be their shield, Ninth. A shield only protects them from the outside world. It doesn't protect them from themselves. Be their shepherd. Be their king. Be their god." His voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper, the words sliding like silk into the cracks of Izuku's logical mind. "You can do it, you know. With your power. You can subtly influence their brain chemistry. Dial down the aggression. Enhance the empathy. You could eliminate greed as easily as you healed that building. You could remove the genetic markers for disease. You could calculate the most optimal path for every single life, the perfect career, the perfect partner, the perfect number of children, and guide them towards it. They wouldn't even know they were being guided. They would simply find themselves living happier, more fulfilled, more perfect lives." The visions began again, but this time they were different. They were not of suffering, but of a chilling, placid perfection. He showed Izuku a world without crime. Streets were safe at any hour, not because of heroes, but because the very impulse for violence had been erased from the human genome. He showed him a world without poverty. Global resources were managed with perfect, logistical efficiency, distributed according to need, not greed. Everyone had enough. Everyone was content. He showed him a world without accidents. Self-driving cars moved in perfect synchronicity. Weather patterns were controlled and optimized. Disease was a memory from a more primitive age. He showed him a world of smiling, happy people. There was no war, no strife, no heartbreak. There was no art born of pain, no philosophy born of struggle, no progress born of desperation. There was only a calm, placid, endless sea of contentment. It was a beautiful, serene, and utterly horrifying utopia. A world without pain. All for One breathed, his eyes gleaming with a fanatic's light. That is the ultimate salvation. That is the final victory. You have the power, Izuku Midoriya. You can give them the one thing they have always craved but could never achieve on their own, a perfect world. All you have to do is take away the one thing that has always held them back, their chaotic, self-destructive freedom. He spread his arms wide, a messiah welcoming him into the fold. Don't you see? You and I are not enemies. We are two sides of the same divine coin. We are the solution. My way was through fear and domination, a crude first attempt. Your way can be through love and protection. But the goal is the same. Order. Perfection. Control. Remake them. Remake the world in your perfect image. It would be the ultimate act of heroism. The ultimate act of love. The temptation was immense. It was a siren song of pure, undeniable logic. Izuku's consciousness, the being of perfect reason he had become, analyzed the proposal. The logic was sound. The objective, the elimination of suffering, was the highest possible good. The methodology was efficient. The outcome was optimal. Nana Shimura's warnings about humanity and struggles seemed like sentimental nonsense in the face of this beautiful, perfect equation. Why allow free will if it was, demonstrably, a bug in the system that only led to error messages of pain and suffering? Why not enforce peace? Why not mandate happiness? It is the most logical path, his divine mind concluded. But deep within the white star of his consciousness, a single, terrified ember of the old Izuka flickered. The boy who had cried watching All Might videos. The boy who had rushed to save Bakugo from the sludge villain with no power at all. The boy who had been inspired by Uraraka's fight against Bakugo, by Ida's grief-fueled rage, by Todoroki's struggle against his father. He was a boy who loved humanity not in spite of its flaws, but because of them. That ember screamed in silent protest. This is wrong. The divine consciousness registered the protest as an internal conflict, a logical paradox. The most logical path was causing an emotional rejection. The data was contradictory. For the first time, the serene, placid ocean of his mind was roiled by a storm of doubt. He looked at All for One, at the devil offering him a heaven built on chains, and he saw the terrible, seductive truth in his words. He had the power. The logic was irrefutable, and the part of him that was still human, the small, frightened boy from Mizutafu, was terrified that the logical part would win. Without another word, without another thought, he withdrew. He pulled his consciousness from the sphere, tearing himself away from the temptation, from the terrible, perfect logic of the devil on his shoulder. He was back in his room. His physical body gasped, a sharp, ragged intake of air. The white light in his eyes flared back to life, but it was flickering now, unstable. He was on his hands and knees on the floor, his perfect body trembling. He had gone into the abyss to understand it, and the abyss had offered him a mirror. It had shown him his own reflection, twisted into a shape of benevolent tyranny. All for One hadn't fought him with power, he had attacked him with an idea. And it was an idea that Izuka could not logically refute. The door to his room slid open. Achiko Uraraka stood in the doorway, a tray in her hands. She had brought him tea and some mochi, a desperate, hopeful gesture of friendship. She had seen his light go out from under the door, and had worried. She saw him on the floor, trembling, and her heart leaped with a strange, terrible mixture of fear and hope. It was the first sign of weakness, the first crack in the divine facade she had seen in weeks. "Deku-kun?" she asked, her voice soft and hesitant. "Are you okay?" He looked up at her, and for a moment, the serene, cosmic being was gone. In his glowing white eyes she saw a flash of something she recognized, a deep, profound, and utterly human terror. His voice, when he spoke, was not the multilayered echo of a god. It was a raw, strained whisper, the voice of a boy lost in the dark. "Uraraka-san," he breathed, his gaze fixed on her, as if she were the only solid thing in a world that was melting away. What if he was right? Her brow furrowed in confusion. He? Who? He didn't answer. He just stared at her, his perfect form trembling with the weight of a temptation that could remake the world, and a dawning horror that he might not be strong enough to refuse it. The devil had planted a seed of doubt, not in his power, but in his purpose. And it was beginning to take root.